Hello and welcome again to another episode of This Week in Christian History. We are focusing this week on the birthday of Francis Scott Key, who any of our American listeners hopefully recall and understand is the person who wrote the poem that would be the Star-Spangled Banner. And he was very much involved in his Christian faith. And so we are pleased to have a top-notch biographer and author, Marc Leepson, who is going to be our guest today to talk more about Key. So, Mark, thank you for joining us.
Nick, it's my pleasure. I appreciate you asking me to do this.
Absolutely. Well, tell us a little background on Key, kind of where he's from and how he got involved and what his kind of vocation and in addition to the other things that he got very passionate about that he lent his energies and time toward.
Yeah, well, most Americans, when they think of Francis Scott Key, think of that one thing, what he did on the night of September 13th, 14th, 1815 in Baltimore Harbor. No, wait, go back. What he did that night, September 13th, 14th, 1814, in Baltimore Harbor during the Battle of Baltimore, and he was
Hmm.
inspired to write the words that will become our national anthem. But I knew that was probably I don't want to say the only thing, but it was just about the only thing I knew when I started this biography back about
Yeah.
in the about 2012, 2013, something like that. And I worked on it for 3 or 4 years, and I learned an awful lot about him. And one was that he was a very pious man. He was born in Maryland, um, and which was and he came from a family of lawyers, right? His grandfather
Mm.
came over here from England and lived in southern Maryland. He was a lawyer. He had a big plantation there, and he was a slave owner,
Hmm.
as was Key's grandfather and father. And Key grew up at his parents' place. It was called Terra Rubra in Western Maryland or central Western Maryland, near the city of Frederick, Maryland, if people know where that is. So it's about
Hmm.
50 miles west of Washington, D.C. But he was out in the country. He lived this idyllic life, growing up with his sister on this. Maryland was a slave owning state at that time. We're talking about the late 18th century. Um, he went away to school uh, to Annapolis at St. John's College, which exists today. It's a
Hmm.
small liberal arts college in the center of Annapolis, Maryland. And at that time, it was a primary school and a high school and a college. So he graduated from there. And then he read law and he became a lawyer. So he set up practice first in Frederick. And then after he and his wife had a couple of children, they moved to Washington, D.C. Like around the turn of the 18th century, around the turn of the 19th century, the early 1800s. And he had his law office in a part of Washington called Georgetown, of course,
Hmm.
which still exists today, although his house is no longer there. But
Uh,
it was so he was a big lawyer in Washington, D.C. He argued over 100 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court.
really?
And at one point, yeah, and some were precedent making cases. He was a very skilled orator and very good at convincing juries and judges in his cases. He was not a political. He never held office, although he was one of the movers and shakers, I have to say, in the early republic of the
Hmm.
United States, in this powerful place called Washington, D.C. Although he never held public office, he disdained politics. He had offers to run, but he never did. Um, and so he was this big lawyer. He did get involved a little bit politically in 1824 when Andrew Jackson was elected president. For
Hmm.
some reason, Key really liked Andrew Jackson's message, um, and his politics. Jackson was our seventh president, but he was the first president who was not born in Virginia or he was the first president who was not born in Virginia or Massachusetts. I mean, he was from
Hmm.
Tennessee. He was an outsider. I mean, outsider, really outsider, you know, for back then.
Right.
Right. So, and he was famous for having invited everybody to come to his inauguration in the White House and so on. Anyway, Key latched onto him and he became one of his legal advisors. He and Jackson appointed him a U.S. attorney for Washington, D.C. So he was U.S. attorney in D.C., the head prosecutor for eight
Sure.
years. At the same time, he had this thriving law practice. It
Wow.
doesn't compute. I know it doesn't compute in the 21st century, but he'd be at the courthouse one day prosecuting somebody, the next day defending somebody in a case, or by the prosecutor's office. So, but also an interesting thing that people might not know about Key politically, and we'll get to the religious component in a minute,
Mm.
is that um, he was a member of Andrew Jackson's kitchen cabinet. So
How about?
you know what the term kitchen cabinet means, right? It means an informal group of advisors, not ones who are approved officially as a Secretary of Defense, a Secretary of State by Congress, and they're the president's closest advisors. In fact, that term was coined at that moment when Jackson did this, because when he came to the presidency, he was warned by his populist or whatever you want to call them supporters not to choose Washington insiders for his cabinet,
Hmm.
but for to make things look good, he did. But he had this informal group of advisors around him, and they met, not literally, but in the kitchen. And kitchens compared to the gilded ballrooms or the gilded
Right,
halls
right,
of,
right,
where the regular cabinet met. So,
right.
and sometimes kitchens weren't even in the house. So Key was an important legal advisor to Andrew Jackson. And so that in a also, as far as the Star-Spangled Banner is concerned, during just very briefly, during the War of 1812, prisoner releases and exchanges were common. After the British gave us one of our worst military defeats in history, not so much in numbers, but in the outcome, and was the Battle of Bladensburg during the War of 1812, when the British rolled over a ragtag group of troops on the east side of Washington, D.C., and then took over the nation's capital, burned the White House. And on the way back out, they took prisoner a man named William Beans, who was a medical doctor who had a little farm east of Washington and had taken a couple of British officers prisoner. Not good. So they released the prisoners. They took Dr. Beans with them. And where did they go? They went to Baltimore because they were getting ready to attack Baltimore with this big armada of ships. And when Dr. Beans's family found out that happened, they prevailed upon Key. Remember, he was a great orator and a great swayer of juries and judges to
Sure.
to argue his case. So and by the way, Washington was small. All the prominent families knew each other. So the Beans family knew the Key family. Anyway, long story short, he goes up to Baltimore and meets with an army lieutenant or a colonel or whatever he was. And the two of them negotiated Dr. Beans's release with the British, but they weren't allowed to leave their ship until the British completed what they thought would be destroying Baltimore. So, with this great bombardment, rockets, red glare, this is only the second time that rockets were used in the history of warfare. They were called Congreve rockets, and they were, luckily for our side, they had no guidance system. So, these rockets were, the rockets, red glare, and the bombs, they had bomb ships, were bursting in air. Key was inspired to write it that night while he was on this mission to free Dr. Bean. So um, that's just in a
Fascinating.
nutshell. This great lawyer and yeah, and
Yes. Well, let's
non-politician
unpack.
politician.
How about
Yeah,
a guy around, not uh, a guy who was in it but not of it, right? I mean, he was around it, but he didn't wasn't his thing. And that's, for somebody, even though Jackson was an attorney and other, right? I mean, so many of the folks who would have been at more of a higher end societal world really weren't very Jackson oriented, right? I mean, they were appalled by him and his people and his crew and his divorced wife and all of that, right? So they didn't like any of that part about him, which of course drew him even more to the people of how we got elected anyway. But we won't get into turning points in an American presidencies as part of our conversation. But hey, we are enjoying our conversation we're having with Marc Leepson, and we're talking all about Francis Scott Key. So. Uh, let's go back and let's do talk about since we just kind of ended on that about the poem itself. So was he basically having to kind of cool his heels for a bit while he was waiting on the army and the British to say, okay, we've done our first big push, we got a timeout. You boys can go back home. I mean, now that we negotiated stuff, or that's what he was doing there, right? I mean, that's why he was.
Right. Well, they said you can go home, but let us finish this battle. So he was on a ship in the harbor and witnessing this 1,500 bombs, rockets overnight. There was also a big thunderstorm that night. So he was witnessing all that. And then in the morning, things were quiet. They did not have Twitter back then, so he didn't know what happened, right?
Right.
So he had to wait until sunrise, and he looked, through his binoculars, and he saw at Fort McHenry that an American flag was there. And he knew that the British had been defeated in the battle. They let him go. He scribbled some words on a piece of paper. He went back to a hotel and he finished the words in a hotel in Baltimore.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is the hotel in Baltimore still there? I mean, I would
No,
have.
I don't, no, no,
Yeah,
that was, yeah, I can't remember the name of it, but it's not there.
I
There
got you.
must be another building on the spot, but yeah.
You would think there's probably at least a plaque. I mean, if somebody would have put it up, right? So he goes back to Washington and then just kind of writes this poem, just kind of out of his own. Was he typically a person who wrote poetry? I mean, is that something he just did as kind of a hobby, or was it he just kind of felt inspired at the time, or how did that come about?
Yes, the latter. Yeah, he was an amateur poet. And I have to tell you, he was not a very good amateur poet. I mean,
Mm,
the poems, and I'm no literary expert, but the poems that he wrote were meant for family and friends mostly. They were like birthday poems he would write. They were kind of
ah,
like the roses are red, violets are blue kind of thing. And
gotcha.
by the way, if anybody's interested, his poems were published long after his death. He didn't even want them to be public. So if you Google Francis Scott Key poems, you'll find it. And it also includes the Star-Spangled Banner. So, for what it's worth, he wasn't a good poet, but he was sort of prolific. By the way, he also wasn't really musical. However,
Mm.
he did write several hymns that have found their way into the Episcopal hymn books. So
Ah,
that was sort of interesting for a guy who wasn't really musical. Yeah.
so how did the Star Spangled Banner become the Star Spangled Banner from this
Oh, right.
poem
Yeah.
that ends up becoming, is it the 1930s really is when it becomes the official national anthem for the US? Is that right?
Yeah. 1931. You're right. It,
Okay.
it was just one of, Key didn't think much of it afterward. I mean, he hardly ever talked about it. If he did, wrote about it. Historians have only found one letter in which he wrote about what happened that night, and he didn't really talk much about anything but how much he didn't like the British, standing there watching all that happen. But so he kind of that just was he put it away, but it appeared on sheet music within a couple of weeks afterwards. So it got into and by the way, it was the sheet music said to it was the original poem was called Defense of Fort McHenry, and it was morphed onto the music for a very popular song of the day called "To Anacreon in Heaven."
Hmm.
It was the theme song of the I don't even know how to say it, Anacreontic Society, which was a British group that morphed over to be an American. It was like kind of like a book club. Men would meet periodically in pubs and they would eat and drink, and this was their theme song. And they discussed the issues of the day.
Huh.
Sometimes you hear it's to the tune of a British drinking song. It was a little more high-minded than that. It wasn't like 99 bottles of beer on the wall. It
Okay.
was it was a little, and it was a very popular tune. So, musicologists who studied this found over 100 words grafted onto that tune. It wasn't illegal back then. It was a common thing for you to write a poem or words to a song and then used an existing melody. So
Kind of like My
it was
Country
just
Tis of
one,
Thee, right?
yeah, yeah, and lots of others back then. So it was one of the songs that was played on patriotic occasions. Being, Yankee Doodle was another. Rally Around the Flag Boys was one for starting in the Civil War era. But as we got into the end of the 19th century, 1880s, 1890s, it gradually picked up steam. The military, both the Army and the Navy, picked it up as their official anthem when they, had ceremonies. And then it took until 1931. There were attempts of legislation because we didn't have an official national anthem.
Mm.
So finally, in 31, and the objections. There were a lot of objections to it. One is that he knows who's tried to sing it is that it's almost impossible to sing. Right? It
Right,
has
right.
like every octave, I think. If you're a man and you start on a high note, you're sunk when you get to
You're,
get to the end.
that's right.
So
That's right.
I won't even begin to do it. But it's written well. So the music was written by a Brit, right? I mean, our national anthem. That was another thing. It's kind of celebrated war. Rockets, red glare, bombs bursting
Hmm.
in air. And one other thing people argued against was each verse ends with a question. Jose does the Star-Spangled Banner. Oh, the land of the free and the home of the brave. So anyway, there was a push and it overcame and it became our national anthem. Right in 1930. That's a good bar bet question,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. Good. I
Yeah,
might, I might win the last round of trivia next time that happens to be able to. So, let's go back and talk about his faith, right? So he was a not just a parishioner who attended church, right? But one who was very active in his church as well.
correct. Yeah, Episcopalian, and so active that uh, well, he there's a letter in which the Episcopal Bishop of Maryland wrote to him and said, "Boy, you do so much in your church." It was St. John's Church in Georgetown that he was active in, although there was a kind of a split in a second church later, but mainly that. And it's a historic church in Georgetown that still stands in Washington,
Hmm.
D.C. If you go by the historic marker mentioned that early parishioner was Francis Scott Key. And he was like a lay minister. He, ministered did hospital visits. He did Sunday school. He once baptized a child when the minister was unavailable and it was an emergency situation. Yeah.
Oh,
And he got a letter from the Episcopal, and he was active in the Episcopal seminary in Virginia, which is still there in Alexandria, Virginia, and in Baltimore. So he got a letter from the bishop, said, you should seriously think about taking up the priesthood. And Key wrote back, yes, I agree, but I need to feed my family. So
right.
he he had 11 children, 9 of whom survived childhood. So, but he did remain very active in his church for the rest of his life, and that was I think he died in 1843.
So he had but he also was involved in national organizations like the National Sunday School Union, right? And the American Bible Society. So this is a guy who wasn't just, rolling into church once a week and sitting in his favorite pew and hearing a sermon and maybe putting a few coins in the offertory and, coming back on the Christmas Eve service, right? I mean, he's obviously very committed and very into understanding the role that Christianity played in his life. Also meant, you know, being, I'm putting words in your mouth here, but I mean that he truly was salt and light, and he really felt like he should be active in his faith, not just kind of contemplative. Is that a fair way of saying it?
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself, actually. And you know, that's the evidence is more than that too, because the letters he wrote a lot of letters. You know, they wrote letters back then, and I read a lot of them. And well, you know, one thing is, you know, he had all those children, and when they grew up, they moved to different places. So there's a lot of letters between him and his children, and you know, he's always quoting scripture in the letters. He's
Mm,
always remind, you know, telling his children, now you must follow the faith and do this and do that and so on. So, and the other large part of his life had a Christian component too, and that was the American Colonization Society. You know, that
hmm
was the movement that grew up in the early 1800s to send free blacks, free African Americans, not enslaved people, but free blacks to a new colony on the west coast of Africa that eventually became the colony of Liberia and the nation of Liberia.
hmm
Um, he was a founding member of the American Colonization Society in 1817 and was on its board of directors and a very outspoken proponent for colonization for the rest of his life until the day he died. And the component of Christianity in that was it was part of it was seen well and by the way, it was a very controversial thing. It's controversial to this day. I mean, at
hmm
first abolitionists thought, well, this might work, but then abolitionists became very, very adamantly against colonization, and Key and abolitionists were at odds his whole, you know, life because of his work with the American Colonization Society. So, and you know, international slave trafficking had been made illegal in the early part of the 1800s. Slavery was legal in states in the United States, but Keith thought of international slave traffic as abysmally horrible. And he wrote about it, and he thought that perhaps colonization might do something to end that. That other component was that it was seen as a civilizing, quote unquote, influence on the people in Africa, right?
mm.
So there were ministers that went over in the beginning. By the way, they didn't check with the Africans when they started this, and
Right.
yeah. So the first missions over there, and you know, thousands went eventually. I think
Sure.
11,000, something like that. But it, the first ones were disaster. First of all, disease wiped out people. There was actually fighting with weapons because of the chiefs who didn't particularly like new people coming over there, taking over their land. But yeah. So and like I said, abolitionists were against it. African Americans were not totally convinced. Well, they weren't. They had, even though 11,000 went, there were, you know, how many millions probably who just, there were riots actually, or big demonstrations against colonization in the northern cities. And the abolitionists saw this as a movement to get rid of free blacks in the North, you know, to
Hmm.
get them out of there. So it was very controversial, and Key defended it strongly until, you know, like the day he died.
Wow. But this is ironic, right? And it's just a complicated part of what becomes for so many folks. He was an enslaver himself, right? But yet here he is, you know, or at least he grew up in his background, right? I mean, he grew up with enslaved people all around him, and then also to kind of take this turn, right? Or to so was he talking out both sides of his mouth, or did he have an epiphany or something and said, "Hey, I want to denounce all of this. I got to move on," or, "Well, I don't want to move so on that I don't have my manservant, but at the same time, I want to be enlightened at the same time." There's always this tussle, right? Somewhere in there.
Yeah, you're right. And the thing is that the, another, it's a complicated issue. And another complication is that, remember, he had his private law practice, and he made a reputation for himself for defending free blacks and escaped slaves who were, you know, people tried to get him back into slavery in the courts in Washington, D.C.
Hmm.
Um, on the other hand, there's always on the other hand, he would defend slave catchers in the courts of Washington, D.C. And then in one famous case, as a when he was U.S. attorney in Washington, he threw the book at a young abolitionist in Georgetown for nothing more than possessing abolitionist literature. They raided his
Wow.
house. They arrested him. Yeah, I mean it wasn't good. So yeah, I mean and like you said, if you cherry pick some of some of his statements about slavery, he could almost read like an abolitionist. It was abominable. Especially he was outspoken against the international slave trade.
Hmm.
But then again, some of what he said you could, is in, can only be read as racist about his feelings about African Americans that we would look at it today. So yeah, but through it all, I always say when I do talks about it, two things you want to keep in mind about this man: piety and patriotism, right? And he
Hmm.
was very patriotic and very pious man. Um, and like what could we even say the number one political issue or the number one issue in the country during the early republic when he was this mover and shaker without actually having held public office was slavery. Every time a new state
Sure.
came into the Union, the Missouri Comp, all that kind of stuff. So that I think is, an important part of who he was. And he did approach it, you know, at least partially, or I say significantly from his belief in Christianity, I would say.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, what about his personal legacy? Do we know much about what his children went on and did in their lives of either who the daughters married or what the sons might have done that would have uh, uh, continued the type of work that he did and patriotism and piety as well? Or is that all kind of lost to history?
Yeah, well, he did have, well, he had a lot of, well, several of his daughters had seven or eight or nine children of themselves. So there's a lot of
Wow.
descendants, but yeah, the only one who kind of made his mark did it in a not exactly great way, and that was Francis Barton Key, who I didn't think we were going to talk about this, but
Oh, well. Yeah, okay.
he, uh, well, his brother, by the way, was his uncle was named Francis Barton Key. So this is second Francis Barton Key, but
Okay.
um, he was involved in one of the first, well, sex scandals in
Hmm.
in Washington, D.C., involving a member of Congress and his wife. So let's just leave it
We'll
at
just
that.
leave it at that. That'll be enough imagination that if somebody wants to go run that rabbit, they can rub it if they want to, right? Yeah, but they'll be hitting Chat GPT as soon as the episode's over to go learn more about that. So, well, tell us more about not only this book, but the other books that you have written and where we can learn more about some of the other subjects that you've written on.
Yeah, well, thanks, Nick. I mean, I've written 11 books, eight of U.S. history. Four of them are biographies. I wrote, aside from Key, I wrote a biography of the Marquis de Lafayette.
Okay.
I wrote one about U.S. Army Sergeant Barry Sadler, who anybody under 50 probably doesn't know, but anybody over like 55 probably does, because during the Vietnam War, an active duty U.S. Army sergeant, wrote and performed the song called The Ballad of the Green Berets, which was
Hmm.
the number one hit of the year 1966. When the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Mamas and Papas, he just had this amazing song that just clicked for some reason. And I'm So I wrote his biography, and my latest book, called The Unlikely War Hero, is a slice of life biography of the youngest and lowest ranking American prisoner held in the Hanoi Hilton, a 20-year-old kid, a Navy sailor who fell off of his ship in the Tonkin Gulf and was rescued by Fisher, a North Vietnamese fishing boat, and they took him over to the Hanoi Hilton. It's a
Really?
different kind of Vietnam War POW story. Yeah.
Hmm.
It's called The Unlikely War Hero. And a couple other books I wrote: History of the American Flag, which is called Flag: An American Biography, that came out in '05 and is still in print. And then Saving Monticello, which I think you know about. It's a history of Thomas Jefferson's house, but it focuses on what happened after Jefferson died, which is a really an interesting and little known story of American historic preservation. That place was in ruins when Jefferson, well, it was on the way to being in ruins when he died. And, July 4th, 1826, right? 50th anniversary of
Right.
the founding of the Republic. Yeah. And his family inherited $107,000 in debt, which was an enormous amount of money. And the house just went
Wow.
downhill from there. And the story is about this family who owned it for 89 years, longer than the Jefferson family, and repaired, preserved, and restored it. So it's a great story of historic preservation, called Saving Monticello.
And how do we find all of these books? If we want, we can follow you, right, and some of the work that
Yeah,
you do, as well as, I guess, any place that you go to buy your books would be a spot where we could find some of these. But also back to
yeah,
your website. Give us that website address.
sure. It's my name, marcleepson.com, MarcLeepson. And yeah, they're on Amazon. The books that are in print, a couple of the ones I mentioned aren't. Your local bookstore can get,
Mm.
or you could search them out online, or autograph copies on my website,
Oh, cool.
marcleepson.com. Yeah.
Cool. That's great. That's great. Well, tell us this as we're kind of wrapping up. Tell us how did you why Francis Scott Key? What made you think, oh, there just wasn't enough out there, or there hadn't been anything updated, or this is kind of a component piece that kind of those of us that are old enough to know who Paul Harvey was, and like, hey, maybe there's a rest of the story, right? I mean,
Yeah, well, yeah, good question. So, it was a process. I mean, part of what you said is true. So, I had just finished the Lafayette biography, which came out in 2011, and I was thinking my next book would probably come out in 2014, and I was looking around for something that an anniversary kind of thing. So, I was thinking about 1914, which was one of the most amazing years in the history of the world.
sure.
You know, the start of World War I, the Russian Revolution, the whole globe changing. And I started to look, and I really couldn't find anything that hadn't been done and done really well. I'm sure that I could have if I dug some more. But as I was doing that, my brain went to 1814, and I thought, oh, wait a minute. And I had written this
Mm.
book called Flag: An American Biography, History of the American Flag, back in '05. So I did the research in '02, '03, '04, and I couldn't find a newer biography of Francis Scott Key when it came time to write about the Star-Spangled Banner than one that was written in 1937. So I checked,
Huh.
and there still hadn't been one. Yeah. So I talked to my agent about it. He didn't believe me. I said, well, go on Amazon. Look. He goes, oh. And anyway, yeah, so that was it. It was, and we did get it out that year, 2014, and there was a lot of interest in the Star-Spangled Banner and Key. Um, and so, yeah, and like I said earlier, I didn't know much more about Key than that he wrote that song. And I found out an awful lot when I was doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Well, one last question that just popped into my head. Besides Key Bridge, right, and going right into Georgetown, right, right from Alexandria, there are there other monuments or statues or permanent kind of displays about Key that you know of off the top of your head?
Yeah, I know a couple. Well, so you're right. If you go into Washington over the Francis Scott Key Bridge, by the way, I didn't say this, but people might be interested to know that they called him Frank.
Oh,
So
really?
we should have been calling him, yeah, we should have been calling him Frank Key during this
Yes.
whole podcast.
Shame on
But
us,
it's
right?
from the letters. I got it from the letter. He signed his letters FS Key, but in the letters, like from his aunt said, "Oh, our Frank has just written this great song," or stuff like that. So anyway, if you go into Washington over the Key Bridge and you turn right onto M Street, there's a park. There's a very small park. It's Francis Scott Key Park. There is
Okay.
a bust and some plaques commemorating him. Baltimore, near actually Fort McHenry, there's a statue of Francis Scott Key.
Okay.
And there's a lot, there's a lot of schools named after him.
Hmm.
There's one around here where I live, Francis Scott Key Elementary School. And also his grave, if you're ever in Frederick, Maryland, the cemetery has a huge grave site, the city cemetery, and I'm blanking on the name of it right now. Mount Olivet Cemetery in
Okay.
Frederick, Maryland, has an homage to Key. There was a big one in Golden Gate Park
Huh.
that was taken down during the George Floyd post
Oh,
2020
really?
stuff that happened. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
huh. Okay. Yeah. It's
And by the way, so uh, Baltimore and Frederick kind of vie to claim Francis Scott Key. He was born outside Frederick. He's buried there. In fact, when he died, he was visiting one of his daughters in Baltimore, and they buried him there. And later, I always forget that word. They disinterred,
reinterred.
re
Reinterred.
reinterred. They reinterred. They reinterred him at Mount Olivet. So, but he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner there. There is a plaque where he died on the struct at the house where he died. But yeah,
Very fascinating. Well, thank you so much for taking time and helping us learn more about yet another example of somebody who had a very active part of their Christian faith that impacted so many different components. You can find one of the things we figure out about people who are interesting and famous is that there are all these different sides to them that people didn't know. All right, as compared to somebody that's not really doing very much, right? There's usually not very many sides to them, but those that do seem to have multiple sides of different components that they were involved in. And so, Marc Leepson, we appreciate your time today. We hope that if folks want to learn more about the Center for Christian History and want to be able to follow us and all the socials and other things to learn every day of some particular interesting thing that happened on this day in Christian history and to follow our podcast and other things that we are producing to help people learn more and more about truth they can trust at the Center for Christian History. Thanks again.
you bet, Nick. Appreciate it.